Welcome to the Explainer. Usually when we study leaders, we're desperately looking for the secrets to their success, right? We want the blueprint to winning. But today, we are totally flipping the script. We're going to explore a massive, unprecedented success story that somehow mutated into an absolute tragedy. We're unpacking the incredibly dramatic story of King Uzziah, a leader whose immense prosperity literally became his total undoing. So let's dive into our source material today and uncover a really profound lesson about the hidden, creeping dangers of unchecked success.
Just picture this scenario for a second. How does a mighty king, a guy who ruled an entire nation for a staggering 52 years, end up quarantined in death? Seriously, this is a man who had absolutely everything, yet he wasn't even allowed to be buried inside the royal tombs with his own ancestors. Instead, he was placed out in an adjoining field, totally isolated from his very own legacy, because he was a leper. It's just a shocking end. And to figure out how on earth he ended up there, well, we really need to rewind the clock and look at exactly where he started. Part 1. An unprecedented monarch's reign. To really grasp the crushing depth of this man's fall, we first have to understand just how deeply entrenched his authority actually was. 52? Wow. Uzziah wasn't just some passing ruler or a tiny footnote in history. He was a totally era-defining monarch. Surviving on a throne for over half a century means one thing for absolute certain. You have an iron grip on your kingdom. You don't just run the establishment, you are the establishment. To his people, Uzziah wasn't just a king, he was an absolute institution. Our source material actually draws a really fascinating historical parallel here to King Senjo of the Korean Joseon dynasty. So what do these two guys have in common? Well, both men managed to hold on to their respective thrones for exactly 52 years. And listen, to survive that long in a high-stakes royal court, you have to completely master the system. You know exactly how to handle your officials, your military, your rivals. Your authority becomes deeply, almost unshakably rooted into the very fabric of the nation itself. Which brings us to part 2, this secret to success. So how does a ruler build such a massive, lasting legacy? Well, he certainly didn't achieve the whole shebang entirely on his own. 16. Yep, 16 years old. That is how old Uzziah was when he first took the throne as just a boy. You definitely don't just stumble into 52 years of entrenched power starting as a teenager without some serious guidance, right? The text highlights his total reliance on a secret weapon, a spiritual mentor named Zechariah. Now, Zechariah wasn't just your standard political advisor crunching tax rates. No, he was someone who understood divine visions and actively instructed the young king, really guiding those absolutely crucial, formative steps as a new ruler. And the source material heavily emphasizes this specific, incredibly tense condition. 3 little words: as long as. As long as he sought the Lord, God gave him success. It completely foreshadows that Uzziah's faith, and by extension his incredible prosperity, was borrowed. It was entirely dependent on his reliance on God through his mentor. It introduces this sort of ticking clock into the whole narrative, doesn't it? What happens when the mentor is gone? What happens when that as long as officially expires? But, for a time, that condition definitely held. Part 3, building a golden age. While he remained grounded, Uzziah ushered in a monumental era of prosperity that put his nation on the map in a massive, massive way. 300,000. That's a huge number. We aren't talking about a ragtag makeshift militia here. Uzziah boasted a highly organized, elite combat force of over 300,000 soldiers. He pretty much single-handedly shifted the entire balance of power in the region. He was, for all intents and purposes, completely untouchable. And this built into just an unbelievable resume of triumphs. He was a military genius who defeated neighboring powers like the Philistines and the Arabians, and he exacted heavy tribute from the Ammonites. But he was also a total pioneer of ancient defense industries. He literally invented machines to shoot arrows and launch massive stones from the city walls. Talk about a game changer. And on top of all that, it wasn't just all about war. He was a brilliant agricultural visionary too. He built defensive towers out in the wilderness, dug numerous wells, and totally transformed the land simply because, well, he loved the soil. His fame spread incredibly far and wide. But, and this is a big but, the text is super quick to point out that it was all because he received what it calls marvelous help. Now for part 4, the dangerous turning point. This massive pivot happens right at the absolute peak of his invincibility. Just when you think things couldn't possibly get any better, the foundation begins to crack.
There is this really tragic irony to human nature, isn't there? The very moment he forgets that marvelous help, human hubris grabs the wheel. As his resume of victories just kept growing, that marvelous help that established him in the first place, it completely vanished from his mind. It got replaced by the heavy, blinding weight of his own towering pride. His ego grew so massive that it literally began pulling him straight down to his own destruction.
And this unchecked pride sets the stage perfectly for Part 5, the ultimate temple showdown. Uzziah decides that his massive earthly authority basically means he no longer has to respect any divine boundaries whatsoever. This scene plays out like a high-stakes cinematic thriller, where he completely, recklessly blurs the line between his political dominance and the spiritual realm.
80. That is the number of incredibly courageous priests, led by High Priest Azariah, who suddenly stood right in his way. Uzziah, high on his own solitary ego, attempts to march right into the temple to burn incense. Now, this was a sacred rite strictly and unconditionally reserved only for the consecrated priests. But these 80 priests, they are quite literally risking their lives, standing up to a man whose mere word has been unquestioned law for decades. No small feat, right?
The escalation here is rapid, playing out in real time. Uzziah forcefully enters the temple to burn the sacred incense. When those 80 priests block his path and bravely tell him to step down, he doesn't feel ashamed, he doesn't back off. Instead, he explodes in a blind, furious rage. And in that exact moment of absolute fury, divine judgment strikes. Leprosy breaks out instantly, right on his forehead. Our source analysis makes a truly brilliant observation here. You see, Uzziah's fatal flaw wasn't merely picking up the censer and making a mistake by crossing a boundary. Honestly, if he had just dropped it the second he was confronted, history might have been completely different. His ultimate downfall was his furious refusal to let it go. As the saying beautifully puts it, a humble person pauses when corrected, but a proud person explodes.
Which leads us to Part 6, the unshakable heavenly throne. Talk about a devastating aftermath. Uzziah spends his final days as a quarantined outcast. He's completely stripped of his majesty, leprous, and totally isolated from the very temple he just tried to conquer. And the nation? They are in complete shock, grieving the loss of the leader they've had for 52 years. But in all of this, the prophet Isaiah looks right past the political chaos to a profound realization. He saw that even when the most entrenched, seemingly permanent earthly pillar collapses in absolute disgrace, divine authority remains perfectly secure and eternal. Earthly power? It's incredibly fragile when it's built on a foundation of hubris. But divine authority? That is entirely unshaken.
So, what does this all mean for us? As you accumulate your own victories and rack up years of success, ask yourself, what exactly are you building? Are you building a stubborn fortress of pride that makes you completely immune to correction? Or are you remembering the help you've received along the way and staying humble? Because as we've seen today, it's a very, very fine line between hubris and humility. Think about that for a while. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.